Hi, everyone. This is the screencastify for Chapter 26 on the Civil Rights Movement. So this is my first time doing an A-Push screencastify, so hopefully everything goes well with it. I'm not exactly sure how long this video will be, um, but a few expectations for me or for you as you watch the video. Make sure you're taking notes, just like we normally would in class. Um, if there's something that you are confused about, make sure you email me, and then make sure you're pausing and rewinding and going over things again if you're confused by it. I can't remember if there are videos in this slide or not, but I might post something in addition, so you might want to pause some things. Pause this video and click on some other resources that I might also attach to this PowerPoint or the Google announcement. So when I'm done with the video, I'll have a couple other things about Chapter 26 to talk about and a couple other things about Google Classroom. So if you are an A-Day person, you already got half this PowerPoint, so you're going to be either watching the beginning of this video to review or fast forwarding to get to the stuff that you haven't learned yet. For B Day, this is all new to you, so sit back and relax. Well, don't relax. Take notes. Okay, Chapter 26, Civil Rights Movement. Here we go. Let's do it. Um, so, how the Civil Rights Movement evolved over time, how the competing ideas and political alliances affect its growth, and that of other social movements. So, the first couple slides we're going to go quickly through. They're mostly information about what's going on before the civil rights movement, and we've talked through a lot of these already. So I'm just going to very quickly go through this. If you look back at civil rights before the 1950s, civil rights is focused on segregation. After the Reconstruction time period, we have Jim Crow laws and black codes in states and local cities that are separating people because of their race. And so from 1880 to 1950, everything is about trying to get rid of segregation and trying to integrate people, not separating people by race. So these first couple slides are kind of just talking about that. The Civil Rights Act of 1875. That basically what you need to know from this slide is that um, um, segregation is an issue. Jim Crow laws are an issue. That's all around. Plessy versus Ferguson at the end of the 1800s said that separate equal is okay. Most African Americans uh, um, live in the South, leading up to the 1950s, even after the Great Migration of World War One. And segregation was around as laws in the South. It's called de jure segregation. Um, and that was true in the South. In the North, there still was segregation. However, usually it was not by a law. It wasn't de jure, it was instead de facto. Maybe I'll try writing something. Well, this isn't good. De facto. So de facto segregation is not a law. It's just saying that there are people being segregated, and that's just the way it is. That's just something that people have done, and or the choices they make. It just creates this natural segregation um, between people who are white and black. De facto segregation could look like a lot of different things that we're going to talk about in just a moment. So the first type of segregation I want to talk about is education. So um, in American history, segregation was mostly done by law. You can see in all these red states here, um, all the red states said that white and black students could not go to school together. Green states said that you could not pass a law segregating people, but red is there's a law saying Black and white students cannot go to school together. We're going to kind of skip over the slide, and I'm going to skip over the slide. We talked about World War II with Executive Order 8802, getting rid of racial discrimination in defense industries. So this is mostly review for you if you need it. Okay, we talked about Double V campaign, trying to get a victory over discrimination at home and a victory over the enemies abroad. We're going to skip to the bottom of this slide here. Really, the most important thing on this slide is with Truman becoming president. He did support civil rights, but at that point, the United States was not really focused on it. Instead, what he was able to do was at the very bottom, you can see he signed an executive order desegregating the military. Before this time, African American and white soldiers could not serve alongside each other. African Americans usually could not be commissioned officers. And now, with this change in 1948, all soldiers, white and black, are able to serve right alongside each other. And what's interesting is right after World War II, in the middle of the Cold War, Russia actually takes this as a opportunity to come at us and say, yeah, America, you're trying to say that you're this great country and that you're the best, but in actuality, you have a lot of discrimination and prejudice in your own country. So how are you expected to save the rest of the world from communism when you can't even take care of the people in your own country? So that's what that slide's talking about. They talked about McCarthyism, so we're going to fast forward to that. Okay. So I mentioned before about how school education was segregated. This has been true for most of U.S. history. That is until 1954. There was a student named Linda Brown. She was an elementary school student, and she was only allowed to go to a school for African American students. When she had to walk to her school, she had to go past nearby white elementary schools that she was not allowed to go to. Her family ended up suing the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, and they ended up winning in the Supreme Court. They said that you cannot have these separate places for students, that it inherently creates inequality. And so what this does is it overturns Plessy versus Ferguson. So Brown versus Board of Education is a very important case. And there's some cartoons showing it. Let's skip those. Now, here's the thing, though. They passed they decided this court case, and what it does is it gets rid of segregation in schools, but it does not get rid of segregation in restaurants, in movie theaters, in buses, in bus stops. All that is still around. It only gets rid of segregation in schools. So this is going to be a major issue for the civil rights movement. Either you go to the Supreme Court and get rid of segregation for every single place where there's segregation, which is everywhere, or you pass some type of national civil rights law by Congress that would get rid of segregation everywhere. But that's going to be very difficult to get the whole Congress to agree to it, or at least the majority of Congress to agree to it. And so until they get Congress to be on the side of civil rights, they're going to have to go and try to fight against segregation every single place where there is segregation, which is everywhere. So Supreme Court passes this decision, getting rid of segregation in schools. However, many schools just don't listen to it. Many communities say they're going to resist this. They say, okay, Supreme Court made this decision. These 9 old guys made this decision. We're just not going to listen to them. And so many schools would block school integration. Some even threatened to close down instead of integrating. Many people joined the Ku Klux Klan, and President Eisenhower didn't really do too much to stop what cities were doing. At least not yet. At least until 1957. In 1957, at Little Rock, Arkansas, the community said that they were going to integrate their high school. They went to go and integrate it, but they found out that the governor of Arkansas, named Orville Faubus, which is a terrible name, he called the National Guard to stop the African American students, the 9 black students who were going to integrate the school. The National Guard blocked them and wouldn't allow them to come into school. So when this happened, that's when Eisenhower has the choice. Is he going to enforce national precedent by the Supreme Court, or is he going to let the states basically ignore what the national government says? And even though Eisenhower isn't too excited about integrating schools, he really believes in national government supremacy. So what he does is he sends in 1,000 federal soldiers, members of the 101st Airborne, so paratroopers, Army guys who fought in World War II, who jumped behind enemy lines on D-Day. Okay, super serious guys, super serious soldiers. They went in and they took over, and they were ordered to protect the black students and allow them to come into school. And the rest of the year, actually, each of the 9 African American students were assigned at least 1 or 2 soldiers that would follow them around all year to make sure they weren't being bullied and beat up or anything like that. So this was one example of basically forced integration of schools. And the battle is not over just because one school would be integrated. It actually is going to lead to many schools fighting over this still. Some schools still will not integrate for the next couple of years. Also during this time is an example of the power of the KKK and really the bad local court systems in the South that protected racial violence. One of these examples is Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a young man from Chicago who was visiting some family members in Mississippi. And while he was there, he was accused of whistling at a white woman in a store. And when the woman's husband found out, he, along with another man, kidnapped Emmett Till, beat him until he was unconscious in a barn, and then threw his body into the local river. His body was eventually recovered, sent back to Chicago, and they had a funeral for him. And usually when there is a person's body that is beaten like that, they have what's called a closed casket funeral. So a mourner would not be able to see the person's body. However, for Emmett, his mother actually wanted the whole country to see what they did to her son, and so they had an open casket funeral, and pictures of the young man's mutilated body were shown in national magazines. And the thing is, with Emmett Till's murderers, there was 2 men who were brought into court, but they were never convicted. In fact, nobody was ever convicted for the murder of Emmett Till. And later that same year, we have probably one of the most famous events of the civil rights movement, and one that you've probably heard of. It's an event that is talked about in elementary schools and kids' books and stuff like that. It's when Rosa Parks refused to give her seat in the city bus to a white man. Now, we're history mythbusters, this class, and it's important to know that sometimes when people talk about this story, they don't talk about it accurately. So one way we hear it inaccurately described is that Rosa Parks was a random woman. She was a seamstress who was tired after a hard day's work, and then decided to um, say, "No, I'm not going to move. I'm not going to move to the back of the bus for this white guy." Like, no, I'm making a decision. I'm standing up. She like decided right there. When actually it wasn't that way at all. In fact, Rosa Parks wasn't the first um, black person to sit in the front of the bus and get arrested for it. In fact, she wasn't even the first person to get arrested for it that year in Montgomery, Alabama. What made her different, Rosa Parks, is that Rosa Parks was a civil rights activist. She had worked for a long time with different civil rights organizations in the area, and this was all planned. It was planned that she would sit in the front. It was planned that she would get arrested, and it was planned that they would follow it up with a economic boycott. What they were going to do is all the African American people who would ride the buses would simply not ride the buses anymore as a protest, because they knew that a majority of the people who rode the buses were African American, which meant that all the buses going would be running with less than half capacity, and be losing money. And they realized that even though power through like voting was taken away from them, um, political and social um, powers have been taken away from African Americans, they still did have some economic power, and they used that here through this boycott. Also, very important person that came out of this is Martin Luther King Jr. He was a pastor in the area who came to the area and embraced nonviolent resistance, because this boycott is what that is. They would walk, you can see in the picture behind my screen, they would carpool, and they would do this boycott until it was integrated. Eventually, a year later, bus segregation was outlawed. So again, it just gets rid of bus segregation, doesn't get rid of segregation at the bus stop, does not get rid of segregation in a restaurant. It's just one individual thing after another that they have to go to the courts and ask to get changed. Now, Martin Luther King becomes very popular after this happens in 1955. He, along with others, will start a new group called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. And their way of fighting for civil rights is nonviolent. Nonviolent direct action is what he called it. So this could look like a protest, demonstration, in some cases, civil disobedience, although that is more confrontational, and they'll do that more later. Early on, they're very uh, not passive, but they don't want to be confrontational. They don't want to do things that maybe some of the younger activists want them to do. Typically, members of the SCLC are older, they're more religious, they're more willing to stay away from confrontation. And so some young civil rights activists said they didn't want to wait for that. They thought they needed to be more direct and more confrontational. So, an example, this is in 1960 when some college students began sitting at white only lunch counters. Many restaurants at this time period would have lunch counters where you could go and pick up coffee and donuts and a lunch, and many in the South were segregated. And so they would do what are called sit-ins, where you go and you sit at a place where you're not supposed to, and you sit there until you're served or you're arrested. And so most of the time, the people doing these knew that they would be arrested, but what it does is it caused media attention. And they knew that if they got media attention, they would help to raise their cause. And so this became so popular, and it worked in so many places around the South, that they formed a new group that was more confrontational. You can see at the bottom down here. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. So typically they're younger, they're more uh, demanding of change now, they're more confrontational. CORE is another one, but it's one you don't need to really know as much as SNCC and SCLC. The one thing that CORE did do is they worked with SNCC on a new confrontational plan to go after the bus transit systems. So all the restaurants and bus stops and bathrooms along the way that would be on the routes for buses, those were segregated. And so CORE and SNCC would go on a bus. They'd travel down to the deep south, and basically they'd test out the desegregation laws that were just passed. They'd go and try to say, hey, these are supposed to be desegregated. They'd go into restaurants where many people would try to stop them. Many restaurants would not be following the orders of the courts. And so they started driving down to the south. And you can see in this picture here, in many places, it did not go well. When they reached the deep south, at one point, I think it was in Alabama, there was a group of KKK members that attacked the bus by throwing a firebomb at it. And you can see here there's fire and smoke pouring out of the bus. People had to jump out. There were KKK members that were waiting for them and beat many of them up as they jumped out. Greyhound bus that was giving them the buses for this freedom rides would actually pull out, and they wouldn't go any further, so they had to get another bus company to bring them. And eventually they continued on and went to more places, and they said, you know what, we're going to try a new strategy. It was called packing the jails, where they knew that whatever they did, they were getting media attention. And so they were going to intentionally break laws, knowing that it would gain media attention. So in 1963, Birmingham, Alabama, was the next target for desegregating the city. Birmingham was often called the most segregated city in America. Many of its places resisted segregation orders, even if it was lawful. And also, there was a heavy presence of the KKK, especially this one guy who used a lot of bombs in the area to bomb homes of black activists. And they began calling the city Bombingham. And so Martin Luther King Jr., with his SCLC, before Martin Luther King Jr. came, the SCLC was there, and they were going to do a new campaign of protesting and marches in the streets called Project C. C stood for confrontation. And Martin Luther King was actually invited to come to Birmingham to help them out. While he was there, they led more protests, and he was arrested. While he was arrested, he was in the Birmingham jail, and there he was being criticized by other black activists for his actions and for being arrested, and what message does that send. He eventually wrote a letter back that was eventually published, and you can see the quote there, and you can look at it later too. But he basically says, we need direct action now. That people who are not supportive of civil rights have always been saying, wait, it's going to come soon. But he's arguing that that wait usually means never, and that the people who are oppressing others very rarely give up their power um, uh, if they want to. It has to be taken from them. And so he's definitely advocating for more confrontation than we've seen him before. Um, so they continued to protest. The local police commissioner, his name is Bull Connor, decided to crush the protest. He was going to bring out pressure fire hoses to spray at people's backs. He'd use attack dogs like seen in this picture, and all of it was shown on TV, and all of it created negative media attention towards the police officers in the city of Birmingham, and created sympathetic feelings for the African American protesters. And this is going to convince John F. Kennedy to support a Civil Rights Act. Here you can see pictures of the fire hoses and the protesters. Basically, here is John F. Kennedy discussing a Civil Rights Act, saying that something must be done to get rid of discrimination in public accommodations. And there's a quote there that you can read, that just discussion of what he's writing about. For your homework assignment, one of the mandatory assignments is on the Civil Rights Act, and so there's part of this speech, I believe, in that assignment. So to get support for the bill that Kennedy liked, the Civil Rights Bill, there was going to be a massive Civil Rights March in 1963. It culminated in King's "I Have a Dream" speech, which is obviously his most famous speech and probably the most famous event of the Civil Rights Movement, talking about his dream for what America can become by getting rid of segregation and seeking equality. The civil rights legislation was hard to get. There's still a lot of violence and extremism, such as a little bit after the "I Have a Dream" speech, there was another bombing done in Birmingham that where a man bombed a local church. It was a Sunday morning, and the bomb actually blew up in a part of the church where there was 4 young girls who were preparing for Sunday school, and all 4 of them were killed. They didn't do anything to hurt anyone, but because that church was used as a kind of a home base for civil rights organizations, that's why it was targeted, and that's why they were killed. And those kind of events would eventually lead to the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, supporting a civil rights bill. And so in 1964, he approved a bill to get rid of segregation in public accommodations. And so it would get rid of things like discrimination in employment, that a business could not discriminate based off of your race, your religion, your national origin, your gender. And then there's other equal access to public accommodations in schools. So this is a major event right here. So now that they've gotten rid of segregation, that's a huge change for the country. And so the next focus on the civil rights movement is going to be on voting rights, because even though they've gotten rid of segregation in public places, that does not give African Americans voting rights. So the next year, there's a movement called the Freedom Summer, where basically they try to push for southern states to allow African Americans to register to vote. Many states and local areas would do things like poll taxes or literacy tests that would try to restrict African Americans from voting. I'm going to skip this slide. You can take a look at that on your own if you'd like. One of the most famous examples of fighting for voting rights was in Selma, Alabama. Actually, it wasn't that long ago. I think it was like a week or two ago. Was the anniversary for it. What happened was a group of people were going to walk from Selma, Alabama, to the state capitol, and they were going to call for a protest of the murder of a voting rights activist, and to try to give more African Americans voting rights. However, you can see in the picture here, there's this bridge that the marchers walked across when they're leaving Selma, Alabama. And after they got across this bridge, a bunch of state troopers attacked them with tear gas and clubs. If you've ever seen the movie Selma, it portrays this whole event here. It became known as Bloody Sunday, and all of it was shown on television. And when that was shown on television, it became a national conversation about black voting rights in America and why so few African Americans were allowed basically to register and ultimately vote in the South. And so the next year, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, it outlawed the literacy test, so no, you can't give a test to anyone to see if they can vote or not. Basically, they tried to make it easier for people to register to vote. And so, with these changes, the Democratic Party is changing too. In the 1960s, with Kennedy and Johnson especially, the Democratic Party is embracing the civil rights movement, and because of that, many Southerners who had for their whole lives voted for the Democratic Party begin switching to the Republican Party, along with conservative Northerners, and we'll talk about that more when we get to our next chapter. Now, when all this is going on, there's a lot of discussion for what is the best way to fight for equal rights. Another movement that's going on concurrently to Martin Luther King's movement is called Black nationalism. So, Black nationalism means a couple different things. If you hear the term white nationalism today means like white superiority over people of color. Black nationalism does not mean that. Black nationalism in the 1960s meant separation between white and black people. In some cases, people would say that black separation means African Americans should all move to Africa. In other ways, other people would say African Americans should stay in the United States and become business owners and politicians in local areas and control their own communities. And so there are many groups that followed this. The Nation of Islam, or known as the Black Muslims, were followers of the Nation of Black nationalism, and its most famous member is there in the picture, Malcolm X. So Malcolm X believed that African Americans should fight for equality, and that African Americans should be separated from white people, because the idea was that no matter what black people did, they would never be able to get equality by living alongside whites. And so Malcolm X believed that African Americans should be separated, that they should be business owners, and that they should be community leaders. And he also advocated for violence in self-defense, which is very different than Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King always said to use nonviolent direct action. Malcolm X was willing to use violence in self-defense. And there's some really interesting things about Malcolm X and kind of his way of life. I encourage you to look more into him. Eventually, though, he got into a disagreement with some leadership in the Black Muslim group and was assassinated in 1965 in Harlem, New York. Another group that would be kind of similar to the Black nationalism group is the Black Power movement. So Black nationalism or Black Power movement is more secular. It's not tied to Islam or really Christianity either. The Black Power movement follows members like Stokely Carmichael, where they turn their attention to poverty and social injustice that African Americans are facing in America, and they focus on racial pride, that African Americans should be proud to be Black, um, and that they should seek out business leadership positions, political leadership positions, that the African Americans should be able to determine their own destiny. That's called self determination. And one of the uh, most radical groups that was a part of the Black Power movement was the Black Panther Party, which you've probably heard of before. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale were the two leaders of this. If you get a chance, stop and look at the 10. Um, um, I forget what they're called. The platform of the Black Panther Party. Um, you can see all the things they want, like protecting African Americans from police violence. They want to say African Americans cannot be drafted in the Vietnam War, that African Americans are being unfairly tried in our court system and should be retried by a jury of their peers. But the Black Panther Party was also a major movement in community organizing projects, like a free breakfast program for children, and that became very popular. And actually, if you watch the superhero movie Black Panther, at the end of the movie, the character Black Panther is talking about like what they're doing to help communities now, and actually a lot of the things that they say in that are things that the real Black Panther Party advocated for in the 1960s. So you can see there's some of the platform. We want freedom, we want full employment, we want education, and the police brutality, and there's more. Another important group that came out of this time period was a group called the Young Lords Organization. These were people who were Puerto Ricans who lived in New York. Puerto Rican um, ethnicity became very prevalent in Midtown Manhattan, and they would also kind of take on some of the ideas of the Black Panther Party and fight for self determination and community ownership and leadership for Puerto Ricans in New York City. So in 1964, um, this began a time period of a lot of uh, racial violence, urban violence, in for the next couple of years. Um, so at this point of the civil rights movement, now that they've gotten rid of the of segregation, as they get rid of voting rights laws, um, what we find out is that there's still societal and economic gaps between white and Black people. Well, they didn't find that out; they knew that, but those things weren't immediately healed by these laws, and so that leads to a lot of frustration among people living in larger cities around the country, and it leads to a lot of conflict, especially when police brutality and unfair prejudice is affecting many people of color in these urban areas. So one example was in the Watts riot in 1965, when a young man was arrested there, and it led to rioting for over 6 days. That led to 34 people dying. In 1967, many cities around the country were engulfed in riots, and you can see the different race riots in this map here. And so, with all of this going on, all this violence, Johnson appointed a group called the Kerner Commission to say, why is all this happening? And basically, they came to the conclusion that there are deep problems of poverty and racism facing people today. That all of this racism is not going to be easily fixed, that there is a lot of things that have happened in the past that have led to today. And it's going to be very difficult um, to narrow the gaps, both in a social way and an economic way. And so this is very difficult to fix. And while this is happening, Martin Luther King would actually go to Memphis to help support African American sanitation workers who were trying to get better pay. And while he was there, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by James Earl Ray, which actually led to more violence and more rioting after he was murdered. And so what we're going to see here is with the civil rights movement of African Americans, there's also going to be other movements that will also kind of take off of the African American movement and use it as a guide or a template. And so one of these is the rights for Mexican Americans and other Hispanics. So we talked about in World War II that Mexican Americans served in World War II. They were not segregated like African Americans were. But in the 1940s and 50s, eventually, Mexican American and other Hispanics um, would be basically kicked out of the country again um, through through movements of President Eisenhower and others. So you can just see in these slides a little bit about what the Supreme Court does to help Mexican American students, showing that segregation laws um, also apply to Mexican American students. Cesar Chavez is very important to know as well. He promoted Mexican political participation in civil rights, that Mexican Americans should basically form unions and use their economic power to try to get more social and political power. He would organize a group called United Farm Workers, where they took a bunch of migrant workers and formed a union, and would gain a lot of power, especially through what would be called the grape strikes. And actually, I just saw at the end of March, I think it's March 30th or 31st, is Cesar Chavez Day. And there you can see just some information about the grape strikes. A little bit about the Chicano movement. The one group I want you to know is the Mexican American Political Association. Basically, them and MALDEF there is going to try to fight for more rights for Mexican Americans and other Hispanic people, and try to be a political lobbyist. So on this slide, the most important thing I want you to write down is La Raza Unida. La Raza becomes a political party fighting for Mexican American rights and trying to gain more political participation for the Chicano movement. And I believe the last group that we're going to be talking about for this chapter is the American Indian movement. We've talked about how American Indians over the last couple hundred years have been facing obviously many very difficult times through the process of losing land, losing reservations, the Dawes Act, that American Indians weren't actually American citizens until the 1920s. So when we get to the 1960s, by this time, American Indians are still facing many problems. After the Great Depression, when Native Americans are basically kind of given free reign over their own land, and the national government doesn't really help them anymore. Um, Many of these reservations are out in the middle of nowhere. They're not next to any cities. So there's not really many jobs for people. In many cases, for American Indians, their unemployment rate is about 10 times what the national average is. Housing is terrible. Disease rates are bad. Access to education is not great. And so American Indians protested for more rights as well. The one group I really want you to write down is the American Indian Movement, or AIM. The American Indian Movement fought for more rights for American Indians, and in some cases they were very radical. One of the radical things they did was they went to the island prison of Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, and they basically took it over with some hostages demanding more rights. Um, and so that was not taken very well from the public, and it definitely caused a lot of awareness for what the American Indians were fighting for, but it didn't gain a lot of sympathy. Okay, and you can see here another time when they took over the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington D.C. And the time they also took a siege at Wounded Knee in South Dakota. We remember that from back in the 1800s when U.S. Army soldiers basically attacked a group of Sioux Native Americans and killed hundreds. They occupied part of the buildings. They were surrounded by FBI agents, U.S. Marshals. 2 people were killed, and eventually they negotiated an ending to it. Oops. Is that it? I think that's it. Okay. Well, that's it for chapter 26, everybody. If you have any questions, please email me. Again, I will be in a Zoom meeting where you can come and meet with me on Thursday and Friday from 12:30 to 2:30. If you want to, you can go on there and talk to me. Otherwise, you can also just email me. That's fine too. Make sure you fill out. There's a Google form that's on Google Classroom. Fill it out by Friday afternoon. That'd be great. So that's it for chapter 26. If you have any questions, please let me know. I will get this out to you as soon as I can. Don't make fun of me for my video. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye.